Welcome, everybody. This is our new 2021 episode of our digital series. And I'm very pleased to introduce Cara LaPointe. She is our special guest today. And Dr. Thomason and myself are super excited for this conversation. Cara, would you like to briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thank you, Ingrid. It's very nice to be here. So my name is Cara LaPointe. I am an affiliate fellow at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. And I also work on assured autonomy at the Johns Hopkins University. I'm pleased to be here today to talk to you.
Thank you so much. As our audience knows, we've had a few episodes during 2020, and it seems that there's tremendous interest in our audience to learn more about data governance, and specifically as it relates to emerging technologies. So our sessions this year will focus on blockchain, AI, quantum, nanotechnology, and so forth. And today we know that you're an expert in many domains, but we wanted to focus specifically on blockchain. And we know you've had a publication that has attracted a lot of attention by many experts in the field. So I wanted to kick our conversation off with asking you maybe to share with our audience what prompted you to write that wonderful publication about data governance and ethics, and specifically how it relates to blockchain.
Oh, well, thank you for those kind words. Yeah, we're very excited about, this blockchain ethical design framework, which we had published out of the Beck Center at Georgetown. So this was a project that came about because Rockefeller Foundation had been focusing on some projects around digital identity and using blockchain for digital identity. And while they were looking at those, they were very concerned to make sure that as they were looking at these types of technologies for digital identity, they could take into account privacy and other concerns about building digital identities potentially using a blockchain. So they had reached out to Georgetown and the Beck Center, and they asked me to come over and help work on this project. I had done some work on ethics and autonomous systems in the past, and so I came over to Georgetown in summer of 2017, and that's when I started working on blockchain. And so we basically, I built a small team, and we went around to experts around the country, around the world, frankly, and asked them, okay, what could possibly go wrong, right? With digital identity. And we looked at a whole range of applications of blockchain, not as much cryptocurrencies, but in terms of all the other things that people were using blockchain for. And we spent a lot of time talking to people and figuring out what could go wrong. And obviously there were many concerns, questions raised. And so we spent time with that and going through and figuring out what are the really essential pieces of this challenge, right? And that's when the blockchain ethical design framework was born. And it really was built as a tool to explore the problems, but then be an actionable tool for how we can overcome some of these challenges. I come to this, I'm not an ethicist by training, I'm an engineer, right? And so, to me, ethics and digital ethics is an issue of when you make small, seemingly unimportant choices in the design and implementation of technology, and those choices can end up having resounding effects on people and communities. Right. And so that's why it's important to give people who are in charge of the development of technology and systems, a tool that they can actually use to do what I say, drive, ethical intentionality into the technology from the very beginning.
Absolutely. And I can share that for me, it was a very helpful tool. I hadn't met you at that time. I had just read that beautiful publication, and it assisted us in designing very specific toolkits, yes, also for other domains where they are seeking guidance. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Thomason, I know you care deeply about data governance and specifically blockchain, and have a lot of thoughts about this. Why do you think it's more important than ever to have a global data governance effort and collaborate with multiple stakeholders?
Well, look, I think Cara nailed the essence of it when she talked about the impact of these actions, because once they're automated, then they can obviously impact on many hundreds and thousands and sometimes millions of people. So I think it's incredibly important to use her term intentionality in design. But I just wanted to kind of introduce some thinking around the levels at which we need to look at blockchain ethics. So we have the technology stack itself, then the applications that are built on it, and then the broader issue of institutions and society, which I think, you know, in the longer run is going to need more attention. And I also wanted to mention to you some work that I became aware of that I'm sure both of you would be interested in, that David Schreier, who's just joined Imperial College in London, is doing, which is around hard coding ethics into algorithms and doing research on that. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do. And I think the work that Cara and her associates did was fantastically useful because it gave a starting framework. But I think there's an immense amount of collaboration, thinking and work necessary, both to get an agreed set of principles around ethics and governance in a digital world, as well as working and thinking about, in a realistic level, how can we think about helping corporations understand how to embed ethics into the work they're doing when they're building their algorithms and their platforms and their applications, and then how we can inform governments about the way that they also need to look at this. Because I think, you know, particularly around data privacy, and this is a very common conversation, the kinds of models of data privacy that we used to use are outmoded now, because we've essentially ceded most of our privacy to the platform companies already, and need to think about how to regain that and what is private and what is property. So I think these are critical issues that we all need to collaborate on all around the world.
Absolutely. And another part that I wanted us to maybe discuss a little bit more in depth is your concept in that publication about the life cycle, how important it is to be consistent and apply these data governance principles and tools that we have at every single step in the life cycle. So in your experience, Cara, and then Dr. Thomason, can you maybe share where do you think are the biggest dangers and potentials for failure in that life cycle? And then we'll also later on talk about opportunities where we can actually have the highest positive impact.
Yeah, I think the life cycle piece is really important, right? Because it's not the kind of thing where you can just design something at the beginning and then never have to worry about it ever again, right? And I think Dr. Thomason was getting to a point that, you know, technology is just one piece of the puzzle, right? So a blockchain is only just ever one piece of a technology stack, and that's only just one piece of a system. The system includes technology and people, right? I mean, there's all kinds of institutional and governance layers around any system. And so, you know, those things change and the context changes over time. But it is important to think about these things from the very beginning, right? Ethics can't be an afterthought. The impact, the social impact on people can't be an afterthought. You have to think about it from the beginning. And I think a robust stakeholder engagement process is very important. You know, I often had, you know, especially in the blockchain space, you'd have a lot of folks that were kind of entrepreneurs and startups and just starting out, and they say, well, I don't have the time, energy, money, resources to kind of think about all of these things at the very beginning. I would always say, look, just take the ethical design framework, which really is just a set of questions you should ask yourself, right? Ask better questions to build better technology. I say, think of it as a risk management tool, right? Go through those questions and just see, are there things that could potentially have huge consequences or have high likelihood of something going wrong? Those are the things you have to think about from the very beginning, right? But to your point, Ingrid, you have to, you know, at every stage kind of revisit that, because context changes, right? In terms of kind of where you are in your design process. Maybe you've taken care of some of the big things at the beginning, but you can start to refine your solutions and really hone in on some of those things that may seem very small from the design and implementation perspective, but will have a big impact. Right? For example, think about, you know, some of the things you hear about cryptocurrencies where people have lost their keys and now they can't get access to, you know, all these cryptocurrencies. Well, key management seems like a very straightforward issue, but it's a real challenge, because when you start to put more and more things potentially into a blockchain system where people are controlling their own keys, if they lose access to that, what if that was access to their house deed or something else, right? It's really important to think about these things all along the way.
Absolutely. Dr. Thomason, any
Yeah,
thoughts on the
I
life
just,
cycle concept?
well, I think it's incredibly important. I think the challenge is how you build it in so that you're continuously thinking about ethical issues at all stages of the life cycle. And we had a session last year around ethical leadership and corporations. And one of the points that I made then is that it's got to come from the CEO and the board, and it's got to be built into the sort of compliance and regulatory systems and processes, because otherwise it's something that's sort of easily put aside as things move on. So that's the first point, I think, is that the leadership, whether it's an organisation or a government, has got to come from the top, and you've got to have the procedures and processes that ensure people understand that thinking about ethics at each stage of the life cycle is really important. The second thing that I think actually might be an interesting topic of a future discussion around this is looking at how people are building governance in these decentralized autonomous organizations. And one that I looked at recently is called the Regen Network, which have got a really interesting approach to the governance layer of the DAO. So I think it'll be quite interesting to maybe in a future discussion have some people who are building DAOs and talk about how they're building the governance mechanisms into them. And then the final point that I wanted to make was just around smart contracts and how you create a life cycle with a smart contract, because smart contracts are autonomous and sort of designed to continue. So thinking about, when you have smart contracts, as Cara said, context changes, and so maybe you need to relook at points in time when you're going to have to go back and have a look at the smart contract and how it's functioning and change that. So I think that this is just such a fast moving field. We're learning things all the time. And if you look at things like the DeFi space at the moment, that's just exploded, and people are experimenting and doing new things almost on a daily basis. We have to try and keep up with that, learn the lessons, and people like Cara, and I hope you continue to do it, distill these learnings and principles so that we can share those learnings with others, because there's no right or wrong answer at the moment. It's too much of a fast moving field.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I think another concept that I specifically enjoyed and wanted to learn more about it was the concept of eco-ethics and the impact on society, and that we need to be mindful. And that's like, in a way, a larger application of data governance, right? Because we need to harmonize our efforts with all other key stakeholders and policymakers and regulatory entities, and consider other ecosystems besides just the blockchain one that would interact with our blockchain ecosystem. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, Cara. How would you advise organizations that do want to do the right thing and do want to establish a right data governance structure for blockchain applications? How can they be mindful about the impact on the environment and the society at large?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about ecosystems, socio-technical ecosystems, socioeconomic ecosystems. It's very hard to develop technology in isolation and have that technology have the impact that you want it to have, right? So you have to take the effort up front. I mean, it's basically, think about it in systems engineering, a design effort. You have to take the time up front to really understand the users. You have to understand the communities. You have to understand the dynamics between users in the community, right? You have to understand your financing ecosystem. We've seen some really dramatic examples with social media sites of, their financing model drastically affects kind of, how the impact that these technologies have on people. You have to understand what other technologies they're interacting with, right? What's the infrastructure? What's the policy and governance infrastructure? And so, I really recommend more than anything taking that time up front to understand the problem, understand the landscape, and try to think proactively. And there's a lot of tools now in terms of, civic tech engagement tools, participatory algorithmic development models, but models that really are what I would say human-centered design models that focus on the human and what the impact is going to be on the human, so that you can design the technology and you can design the governance structures, right? Governance is the linchpin for all of this, right? Especially with blockchain, because if you think about what blockchain is, you basically create a set of rules, and then anything that's going to go onto a blockchain has to abide by those rules, right? So who gets to make those rules, right? How do those rules change, right, as the world changes? So how you establish your governance and how you establish the kind of governance of the whole system around the blockchain as well is really important.
Absolutely. Jane, I know we've talked in the past about the ecosystem, and you have some very remarkable insights regarding that.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Cara. And I guess I just want to tackle it at the local level, which I think is easier, because there are communities, they see, feel, and live the consequences of their decisions, and they're far more likely to make decisions that are going to look after themselves and look after their land. I think where it becomes far more complicated, because in the end, all of these communities live on the same planet. That's our home, and we need to be looking after that. And what we've seen in the pandemic is, in fact, the fragmentation of what was the post-Bretton Woods global governance systems. So we've seen that. In addition, we have platform companies now that are more powerful than most economies in the world. And they're elected by no one, but they have enormous power. So I think there is a question around this governance of the global commons and what that kind of structure is going to look like in the future. And then the third point that I wanted to make is we do have things like Global Compact and ESG investing guidelines and so forth. So to the extent that these things exist, I do think there's an advocacy role for all of us to re-look at them and make sure that they're up to date with these kinds of human-centered, planet-centered approaches that we all need, and that they're reflected in these investment guidelines and these guidelines for corporations.
Thank you. And I guess the last question in this section about the governance and the setup and the design, I wanted to get your thoughts on how would you advise organizations that, again, we're assuming they want to do well. How would you advise them regarding the cadence of interacting with the technical, because you mentioned you want to have technical ecosystem interaction, socioeconomic ecosystem interaction. When I have the opportunity to talk with other experts in various forums, such as the European Union Commission or World Economic Forum committees, we have usually a lot of experts, like a lot of them. Everybody's with their niche, and it's very difficult to decide what are you gonna tackle first, right? And what's the optimal cadence? So that's the most frequent, I think, dilemma that I see in organizations. At this point, I understand that we need all points of view and that we need to understand all the pain points for all the stakeholders, but what do you do first? And do you start with the legal framework? Do you start with the regulatory framework? Do you start with the compliance or with the technology or with ethics? I always say ethics first, but I would love to hear what you both have to say. Cara?
Well, I think the very first thing you start with is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Right? Too often we come in with a technology and try to, fit it into a situation, but I really take the time to understand, okay, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, or the opportunity I'm trying to take advantage of? And then, you don't necessarily have to have every expert and every opinion in the room, but you need to have a diverse set of voices in the room. And that can be a relatively small group, but making sure that they have a diverse set of perspectives to even start the conversation, right? And to understand, what is the problem and what is the impact that I want from this technology that I'm building and introducing. That's where you start.
Absolutely.
I'd like to come in, Ingrid, with an off the wall thought, because Cara's right. What's the problem we're solving? Are we creating a whole new global system that focuses on people and the planet, not just profits to shareholders and so forth? And, you know, your point is incredibly relevant. There's nothing more difficult than getting a bunch of technical experts together, because they're all so expert and they all, as you say, have their niche, and they're frankly not interested in anything outside of their niche. Usually it's hard to get a technical expert who's also a kind of big picture thinker. And so I wanted to just proposition an idea, because I've been reading and thinking a lot about the future of immersive technologies and immersive media, and thought, well, wouldn't it be really great, in fact, if we created some sort of event or series of events, almost recreating Bretton Woods in a digital age, but that you allowed the different technical groups to have certain voting or staking rights in terms of decisions that are getting made, and that you actually have something along the lines of a kind of strategic hackathon about how you approach it, and the different groups can stake they can either want to invest in projects or they can vote on ideas, and everyone gets to participate. And in fact, you could have the community outside, like American Idol, also voting, so you're getting community opinion. So, you know, I kind of think we come from a background where, like World Economic Forum or Davos, people come, they have meetings, important people make speeches, you know, organizations go away and write papers, and that's how we do this. But I think we should get much more creative with the technologies that are available about creating a far more participative experience using these kind of immersive technologies. So that's my contribution for the day.
Well, you gave us a lot of food for thought. Cara, you want to comment on this? Because I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's important, right? I think it's really important, because the ways that we have traditionally made decisions, it's a small segment of the population, whether in some cases it's the technologists, whether in some cases it's kind of high-level government officials. But I absolutely think more inclusive participatory development models, whether that development is around a technology, that development is around governance, I think that's really important. And to your point, Jane, we absolutely have the tools to do that much better today, right? Because people are connected, they're instantly connected, right? In so many cases. So I completely agree with you, and would love to sit down with you and me on a whiteboard and think of, you know, some of the ways we can do this, right?
We should do that. We should do that. I think it'd be a great challenge and immensely powerful if we could do it.
So we have ourselves a strategic ton set up instead of. So one other thought I wanted us to make sure we address with our audience. I get asked all the time, if you have one single barrier you can choose that really prevents long-term sustained data governance? Because let's pretend someone calls a consultant, they do a great job when they launch a project or a new problem they try to solve, but then everybody forgets, like we talked at the beginning of our session today, that this is an ongoing cycle. It's never stopping, right? So what do you think is the biggest barrier to long-term ongoing data governance that you've both experienced in your professional encounters? Cara?
Yeah, it's a challenging question to think what the single biggest challenge is.
We have so many.
Very big challenge is interoperability, right? There are so many, but I think interoperability, when you start to talk about data and data governance, and the fact is that, you know, people talk about us living in an information age. I often say we live in a data age, but being able to translate that data into information that's useful and ultimately actionable is sometimes limited, because we have many different ways of doing kind of data governance at a very kind of data management and data curation level, right? And that makes governance really challenging when you can't even be interoperable with the data.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was my point. I'll send you the slides after this when I had the opportunity to share my experience at the European Union. And I really made 2 points. interoperability. And then I said, if I had a second chance to add another one, would be portability, because I think that's another challenge we're going to have, right, across all the different markets and industries. And we know that there's so many differences in continents and state regulatory guidelines. So I think definitely interoperability and portability are the biggest nightmares. Jane, what about you? What would you pick?
Well, I agree with both of those, but I'm just going to add ignorance, mass ignorance in governments and in society, knowledge of what's out there, any kind of reimagination of the world that's possible with digital tools, and any kind of vision about going there. So I encounter that barrier every day. People just have no idea. And I think that's something that, to get people to the point where they're willing to work on this, I think we've still got a distance to go.
Absolutely. I think that was the impetus for our series, because we wanted to increase the knowledge sharing, advocate for a better understanding of emerging technologies, right? Dispel some of the myths, but specifically around blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So I think that was one of the original causes why we started this series. Another question I get quite a lot is, if you can maybe shed some light on it, your opinion is if we should have different frameworks for blockchain technology or larger ledger technology versus crypto and digital assets. That's a very frequent one I get. And then as Jane mentioned, even for DAO. So I've heard some people that now want 3 different frameworks, and I'm skeptical about 3 different frameworks, because I believe ethics and data governance, they're like 90% of things you can do that are in common, but I would love to hear some different thoughts. Cara?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what level you're talking about the framework, right? In terms of kind of putting principles into practice, it is important, and it can be different. Obviously, when you have blockchain and distributed ledger technologies in different spaces, in different domains, there's different regulatory environments. Obviously, cryptocurrencies is a very different regulatory environment than if you're creating digital identity, or if you're creating supply chain management, right? Or smart contracts, right? So, just by default of those different fields, there's different kind of big picture field specific regulatory frameworks you have to work with, right? When you think about ethics and the ethical framework, we actually talked a lot about this when we were building the blockchain ethical design framework. Is it even possible to come up with one, right? And so ours is we tried to do it at a high enough level that it was translatable across domains, right? As I said before, we didn't focus on cryptocurrencies as much, right? But we really looked at the other applications of blockchain, but we tried to keep it at a high level, because ultimately what you're doing is people would say all the time, what's ethical? What is this ethical or not ethical? I said, look, what we created with the ethical design framework is not a decision about what's ethical and not ethical. It's a set of questions you need to ask in your context and in what you're trying to do. Because the fact is that ethics is often contextual. There are different societal norms in different places. So it's hard to have some absolutes. I mean, obviously there are some values that underpin, right, that are common throughout. But when you get back to your specific question in terms of for these different types of, whether DAOs and blockchain and cryptocurrencies need to have different frameworks, I think if you make the framework high enough, then it is translatable, but there will obviously be specific concerns in each field. And you do want to explore the depth of those, right? That is also very important.
Absolutely. Jane?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. One of the things that we currently don't have is a kind of agreed taxonomy for all the different iterations of blockchains and distributed ledgers. And I think if we can get to that, then we can start looking at these different classifications, which personally, I think they're all kind of subsets, if you like, of distributed ledger technology, of which blockchain's one, and of, you've got crypto and so forth. But even within that, and this is, I'll just go through this because we were discussing this last week, and a regulatory lawyer was talking about, the way the regulators look at blockchain and crypto, and they tend to lump it all into the same bunch and treat it as if it's some sort of financial instrument. And he was saying that, You've got category 1, which is physical items that are represented on a blockchain, like gold coins, gold bars, harvests of coffee in sort of supply chains, shipping containers and so forth. And then you've got traditional intangible assets that get digitally represented, like securities, stocks and bonds, derivatives and so forth. And then you've got the real native crypto assets that are actually used on particular blockchains to make those blockchains function. So I'm not saying that's the sort of definitive way of looking at it, but what I'm seeing is people around the world are trying to figure out what these categories are and start trying to define them, because I think once you've defined them, then it's much easier, whether it's, a database or whether it's a security or whether it's a currency or whether it's just a commodity, then you can start thinking about, what are the frameworks that apply to them. But I suspect it's possible to have, as Cara suggested, a high-level generic framework that can be applied, but at a level of detail, then speculative cryptocurrencies, which do have KYC, AML issues and all the rest of it and can be used in terrorist financing, are going to be looked at quite differently than, real estate that might be on a blockchain or the tokens that operate within DAOs.
Absolutely.
And I think this digitally native point is really, really important, right? That some things are digitally native, so they have a fundamentally different type of governance mechanism, right? And frankly, in some ways, it's much easier to have governance mechanisms for digitally native assets. Whereas whenever you're talking about something in the physical world, you have that added layer of having to translate between the analog and the digital, right? Which is be very complicated to have an effective digitally based governance system when you have that translation.
Absolutely. And I can share for the Government Blockchain Association, we've approached it like that after long discussions and a lot of pros and cons. We did one very high level that can be used by each industry sector then as a guide, and they can enhance and refine and provide further details that, let's say, for healthcare or real estate or other industries. So I think that was the only way we could decide to advance fairly quickly and provide some guidance. So in our last part for today, I was hoping we can end on a positive note and talk about future opportunities and directions. And Cara, you opened up mentioning digital identity, and that's something that Jane and me also care a lot about. So I'm very focused on digital identity for children. We know there are 50 million children in the world that do not exist. They don't have any identity. And I do believe that digital identity can be one of the solutions. And then, of course, I also deeply care about digital identity for health and precision medicine. So maybe we can share a little bit about thoughts related to the impact that digital identity can have and what type of data governance do we need to put in place if that's going to be a larger scale adoption. Cara?
Yeah, so digital identity, there is so much potential here, right? If you look around the world at how many people don't have any kind of formal identity, and what is your first entry point to formal systems, right? Whether it's credit systems, often medical systems. So having identity and provable identity is a really powerful thing, right? So there's a lot of advantages to creating a digital identity system. There's also challenges, right? As I talked about at the beginning, the whole reason that Rockefeller Foundation had kind of reached out and wanted to fund this work at the beginning was because they were excited about digital identity, but also wanted to make sure that you could do it in a way that really privacy and privacy is preserved, right? And especially when you start to talk about children's identity, I think this is really important. I think that blockchain has a lot of potential in this space, right? I think the ethics are really, really important, right? Thinking about who has identity, right? In a lot of situations, we don't really give people identity until they're a legal adult, which can be, different ages in different places. But, understanding kind of who has identity, that goes back to the governance as well, right? How do you decide who's got identity? I know we've talked a lot in the past about kind of digital identity for marginalized populations, right? Think about homeless populations. There have been some pilot studies around the US in terms of, can you provide a digital identity and incentive, kind of token incentive system for homeless populations. But when you start to look at the service providers that you could connect those homeless populations with, some service providers, that are government based, does identity start at 18? What do you do with folks who are, maybe homeless teenagers, right? That are refusing to go into shelters and things, how do you link them up with services, right? How do you create the governance around who gets that identity? So, I think there's a lot of exciting potential, and there's just a lot of need here, particularly for getting the diverse voices into the picture.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
Jane, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to echo the sentiment that there's a lot of potential, and I do believe actually that providing digital identity at birth can help with a lot of issues. For instance, now the pandemic has also highlighted, right, what happens if children don't even exist. How can you make sure they get the healthcare they need or the education they need or are not subject to many other abuses, right? So I do believe that actually even earlier at birth, making sure that we provide digital identity can help with financial inclusion, bridging the educational divide, and many other things we deeply care about at the global level. But Jane, go ahead. I know you have some very...
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit to it, because I think technologically it's possible to create a secure identity for anyone, whether at birth or at any age, and to, hash it up onto the blockchain while preserving privacy. That can be done, is being done, has been done all over the place. I think the issue is, and to some extent Cara introduced it, is who is going to recognise and accept that identity, and for what can it be used? Because we tend to sort of think of identity as a passport or a driver's license or something like that, but they're actually not. They're certifications by government, saying that you are a citizen of the United States or whatever it is that you are. And so I think the big issue is who can issue and who will recognise it, because the same thing came up in a discussion that I was having about identity in humanitarian settings. And they used digital identity in humanitarian settings, and the Red Cross is creating attestations around those digital identities to say that this person, can pay back their debts, or this person has this skill. But they're not useful anywhere outside of a refugee camp. So I think that the visionary challenge that I would have is how to be able to create that identity linked to a biometric secured somewhere, that can be durable for the lifetime of a person, and that you can add information like, can they drive a car safely? Or you can add information about, their credit scoring and so forth. But I think the issue that we have is that in every country, the way that identities are issued and who's allowed to issue them and so forth is very, very different. And then the other side of it, Ingrid, and I think you implied it there, is that once you have it, it can become a tool for bad actors or for, regimes to be able to target people that they might not like. And so there's kind of two sides to that coin about the benefits of an identity, with the risks of having an identity that people are able to access and find you.
Absolutely.
And Ingrid, if I can jump in really quick again, I think that, Jane brings up so many of the complex issues around this, right? One, that it's what these identities are going to be used for, what that entire human governance layer is outside, what's that entire human ecosystem that these identities are going to be used for, right? The idea of having durable identities, which is very powerful and has a lot of positive benefits, but there's also many, many reasons why somebody changes their identity in their lifetime, right? Think about people who have been victims of violence, who are kind of political refugees, right? I mean, there's many, many reasons to change your identity. And as we start to put things in an, in an immutable, effectively immutable system, right, especially linking biometrics, there's a lot of ethical challenges, right, that you have to think through very carefully about doing it in ways that are beneficial, but you're also mitigating the negative impacts. right?
Exactly.
Because we often, technologists don't usually create technology for bad purposes. They create it for good purposes. But then one of two things happen, right? You can get unintended consequences, or you can get other people who are maliciously, manipulating the system to their benefit, right? And you have to be able to build robust and resilient systems, in this case, identity systems, that will be able to prevent the negative impacts from both of those avenues. And that is a challenge, right? We don't have a single answer to that. And that's why it also becomes very contextual for how you're using these systems.
Absolutely. And we had a great session last year on cyber ethics. And I think that's the major challenge that we face across the board with everything we talked today. All the opportunities we have in deploying blockchain, it always boils down to what we are facing with unintended consequences, right? Even if we try to do the right thing otherwise. So I think we're at the end of our session today, but I'm sure our audience enjoyed it. And as always, we want to thank everybody for watching. Also check out our social media channels for the blogs and articles that we might publish in conjunction with the recording of this session. And thank you so much, Cara, for making space. And thanks again, Jane, for doing this together. We really appreciate everybody joining us. Thank you.
Thank you too, Ingrid, and thanks, Cara.
Thank you very much. This was a pleasure.